Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. Happy to have you with us. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, good to be back with you.
It's good to be back on with you, Eugene.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, of course, and we've got a great show for you here today, continuing to talk about many different aspects of the Palestinian struggle, including what's going on in Canada, discrimination against Palestinians here in the United States. But we're also going to be talking about the Congo and some of the issues that have been happening there, another massive conflict where many millions have died, but one which there's very little attention on. We'll also be talking about the rise of the far right, and also pro-Israeli. I guess those things tend to go together. Politicians in a number of different countries and what that may pretend for the world, and how Gaza is changing the world, what the, quote unquote Israel-Palestine conflict means in a multipolar context. And we'll probably get to a few more things as well. But great show. So, use this opportunity to let folks know that we are here so that whoever is following you can follow us. And since you are already here, hit the subscribe button so you can be subscribed to us, and also make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts about all the fantastic content we're putting out, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek, which is putting out excellent interviews on a very regular basis. You won't want to miss that. Rania, what else should our viewers know?
Well, if you support independent media such as Breakthrough News, you can become a member by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, which will give you access to exclusive content, as well as make you a supporter of a really important platform, as we've come to learn in this very dark time as we watch this genocide in Gaza play out. So if you are able to become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, again, you'll get access to exclusive content, as well as to some really cool merch, including this very cool mug. The one that Eugene has, I don't have yet, so I'm going to come get one soon.
Yes, please do. We have multiple colors.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Also, one more reminder just to those who are watching, please make sure you hit that like button, or I should say smash the like button. That's what the cool kids say, Eugene.
Is it?
They say smash that like. Yeah, they say smash that like button. And then there's like sound effects.
Really? On what? Okay.
We have to
I'm just going to go ahead and accept that.
Like button. We'll smash the like button because it helps boost us in the algorithm. The more people who like the show, the more people get to see the show. So
yes,
that's
indeed.
all I have to say, Eugene. That's my spiel.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. Definitely smash the like button, as the youths apparently are saying these days. Well, Rania, before we get into some of our first guests, of course, there was a milestone yesterday, one that for many was much celebrated. That is the death of Henry Kissinger, former national security advisor and Secretary of State, one of the so-called giants of American diplomacy, died at the age of 100 in his home in Connecticut yesterday. Of course, the historian Greg Grandin has, who's the author of the book Kissinger's Shadow, has estimated that Kissinger's policies during the Nixon administration and into the Ford administration resulted in 3 to 4 million deaths. That's both direct policies like in Cambodia, where he backed the genocidal bombing campaign, or Chile with the overthrow of the Allende regime, which was heavily masterminded by Kissinger, and also, as Grandin calls them, crimes of omission, which of course saying nothing when the Indonesian government committed their massacres in East Timor and other similar issues. Of course, Kissinger also known for being more or less the architect of Sino-American relations starting in 1972 and continuing until relatively recently in the new Cold War era. So, of course, the eminence grise, if you will, Henry Kissinger, of so much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. But Rania, I think because of that role, his hands very, 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 very bloody, and the things he accomplished, while certainly notable, except for maybe a few, almost 100% malign and terrible.
You know, it's really amazing when you think about 3 to 4 million deaths. That's like a Nazi-like death count. But not even just any Nazi, not like your typical SS soldier. We're talking like the leadership, you know what I mean?
Yes.
All in the name of the ideology of American empire. It's pretty disgusting. I know it's maybe like a little bit overdone, but I don't think it can be overkill after someone, a figure as disgraceful as Henry Kissinger has died. I want to read the Anthony Bourdain quote.
Please,
From
yes.
Anthony Bourdain's book, because it's a good one.
R.I.P.
So Anthony Bourdain writes in his book, once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands. You'll never again be able to open a newspaper and read about that treacherous, prevaricating, murderous scumbag sitting down for a nice chat with Charlie Rose or attending some black tie affair for a new glossy magazine without choking. Witness what Henry did in Cambodia, the fruits of his genius for statesmanship, and you will never understand why he's not sitting in the dock at The Hague next to Milosevic. And I mean, you got to appreciate the fact that he just straight up said like the most raw emotion you feel when you hear about what Henry Kissinger's done. In many ways, it's like, wow, this guy got to live to be 100, a comfortable 100.
Very comfortable, very rich as well.
Yep.
Made quite a bit of money. You might relevant to our current moment. He's being lauded, of course, by all Israeli leaders. Played a major role, of course, in the so-called resolution of the 1973 war in a way that massively increased the relationship between the United States and Israel, the weapons relationship that paved the way for the so-called peace deal between Israel and Egypt, the normalization there, which of course was to the great detriment of the Palestinian people. So long history on that issue as well, and what again I think you could consider to be a quite malign circumstance. But yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to note also, like, when we think about Henry Kissinger, everybody likes to talk about how he's a Holocaust survivor, this sort of thing. And I mean, the irony of all that is that Henry Kissinger played a huge role in pushing the kind of anti-communism that allied with Nazis across Europe and across the world. Which is a really disgusting and ironic way for someone to behave, having the background that he has. That's all. I just want to throw that out there.
No, I think that's an important question. I mean, an important point to make. And I think it speaks to, sort of how that is deployed as a tactic to shield him and others, quite frankly, from their own subsequent crimes. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of these things have started to fade with history over time. I mean, the bombing of Cambodia, huge amounts, just millions and millions of people. We already mentioned the 3-4 million people. Not only are people killed, they're maimed, the use of Agent Orange. I mean, things like the Christmas Day bombings. I think that was 1970, might be 1971, where, essentially in order to try to bring the Vietnamese to the negotiating table, they just launched a massive bombing campaign designed to kill tens of thousands of people. There's a long story about it. It's worth reading Seymour Hersh's book, The Price of Power, Kissinger and the Nixon White House, and it gets very deep into a number of these different points. But to see the level of just absolute callousness with which the use of mass bombing and, large-scale invasions of different parts of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos for no reason at all, when they knew the war was 100% lost, but just in order to try to change the positioning a little bit at the negotiating table so that they could get out of Vietnam but still look like they had gained something from it. They were willing to sacrifice tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives for small little changes on a piece of paper at a negotiating table. And it really is just unbelievable. Also, of course, he was a total inveterate liar all the time. The manipulation of the press, I think, Rania, is also one of the most notable things about Kissinger that book is in quite a bit, that quite frankly, a lot of the worst things that he was doing at the time were covered very positively because he developed a highly refined system for manipulating the press, willingly so. I mean, I think in some ways they wanted to be manipulated. There's no doubt about that. He was using access journalism to cultivate his relationships with different people in the press. But the way that the mainstream media in the United States, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the NBCs, even the foreign media from Europe that was reporting on the United States was essentially being manipulated to put out this pro-Vietnam War, anti-Allende, other forms of just disgusting imperial propaganda that, of course, now all those papers, they're going to run their obituaries today. They're going to include their whatever little paragraphs of like, yeah, he also did a lot of bad things, and some people are upset about that. But they're certainly not going to do any big, deep expose about how their own reporters at the time were equally as complicit with the Nixon White House and with Kissinger, and of course, later on the Ford White House and with Kissinger and many of these crimes because of the access journalism reality that many of their columnists were using. So, of course, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think we see a lot of that right now with the press. But I have to say, when we think about what is the legacy of Henry Kissinger, I would say, really perfecting the extreme manipulation of the press from the White House. I mean, no one really was better than he was at that. Many people have used it for bad reasons since then, but I think it's going to be up there in terms of the crimes that the press was complicit with vis-a-vis Kissinger.
Well, I just wanted to read this from something that Greg Grandin, who you referenced earlier, said to Rolling Stone, because I think it's important to point out, as we do hear some of the praise that he does get for some of the stuff that he did, at least like in the mainstream. And that is, there's no doubt he'll be hailed as a geopolitical grand strategist, even though he bungled most crises leading to escalation. He'll get credit for opening China, but that was de Gaulle's original idea and initiatives. He'll be praised for détente, and that was a success, but he undermined his own legacy by aligning with the neocons. And of course, he'll get off scot-free from Watergate, even though his obsession with Daniel Ellsberg really drove the crime.
No, it's 100% true. It's honestly, I'm telling you, people have to read this book, Price of Power, by Seymour Hersh. I mean, it's unbelievable how Kissinger basically got totally off the hook in Watergate. I mean, he was deeply, deeply involved and came out totally unscathed. But that, again, is another example of how he was able to manipulate the media. But yes, I think it's very important that, we continue to remember this. And of course, we also have to note that it was Kissinger it's an interesting story. So in 1968, he, at that time, was pretending to be leaning towards the camp of Lyndon Johnson because he'd been supporting Nelson Rockefeller, who, of course, was Nixon's opponent in the Republican primary that year. And so when Rockefeller lost, he starts putting out these feelers to the Democratic camp, and he's, a big strategist, blah, 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 saying, I want to work with you, so on and so forth. But then he's secretly giving information to the Nixon campaign, who is then using that information, especially the knowledge that there is a potential peace deal between the United States and Vietnam that they were thinking they were going to try to see if they could pull out at the last second, kind of as an election day ploy. And of course, we now know historically Nixon, through the auspices of other individuals who were, close to the South Vietnamese regime, says, no matter what, don't make any deal with the Johnson administration because whatever, we're going to make a better deal with you afterwards. So essentially, Kissinger was a party to scuttling an earlier end to the Vietnam War, which of course under him and Nixon would continue for another 4 or 5 years, just for his own career, just so he could find a way to get in with Nixon, who he figured would undoubtedly get into the White House. But of course, he was playing both sides of the fence the whole way. But I think it's a notable factor when you also look at his legacy, is the role he played in that now relatively famous episode in presidential politics, where, of course, a peace deal was deliberately scuttled by the Republicans in order to, make sure that they could win the election. So again, we could go on. There's many books. You mentioned Greg Grandin as well, whose book, the Kissinger's Shadow. It's a great book. But yeah, I mean, I think these people get all these laudatory attributes, once they die. And unfortunately, that kind of, whitewashing then becomes so much part of the legacy.
Well, it's to the point where, do you remember when Hillary Clinton was running in 2016? And I think there was like some debate between her and Bernie Sanders. And she was asked, who are the people you look to, like, for foreign policy or something, like inspiration? And one of them, she said, was Henry Kissinger. And as frustrated as we all are with Bernie Sanders right now, I'll have to give him credit for, I think, at some point saying, Henry Kissinger is the worst person to look to. I will never look to him for advice on foreign policy. And it was just like, and then he was like attacked for that because it's seen as kind of blasphemy in mainstream foreign policy circles in the US, because you're just supposed to adore and like admire Henry Kissinger for, I don't know, I guess the more people you kill for US empire, the better. I'm not even sure like how that's supposed to translate.
You may also remember, though, Rania, that Kissinger was briefly canceled last year because he said the thing you're not supposed to say about Ukraine, which was that that Ukraine should give up territory, sign a peace deal, that the war probably never should have happened in the first place, that it was, to some degree provoked by NATO, and now the U.S. just needed to make a deal and move on. Now, of course, he then subsequently came out like a week later and said, well, I was misunderstood, and I'm 100% behind Ukraine, and blah, 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 blah. But it just showed the sort of mass hysteria on that issue that even Henry Kissinger, could not actually actually come out and say something against the mainstream consensus without being, massively attacked. Not that I'm giving him any credit for anything, quite frankly, but I do think it is a notable factor about the sort of tail end of his career. And of course, also on China, as the architect of the 1972 start of relations, he was off message from the point of view of where the U.S. administration is now, which is why probably the only country in the world where people are saying positive things about him right now is actually China, because, in the context of the new Cold War, the policies of Kissinger certainly look much better, I think, to the average Chinese person, of cooperation between the countries as opposed to, potential war. But interesting, complex, complicated legacy. Read those two books, Kissinger's Shadow, Price of Power, Kissinger in the Nixon White House. You'll know everything you need to know. Both great books, and actually very important history on a number of different points. But that's it. Kissinger, 100 years old, died yesterday at his home in Connecticut. Well, we're going to keep moving forward here, Rania, and we turn into a topic that is, I think, been very much in the minds of many of us in the most recent days, and that is the very distressing rise of hatred against Palestinians, those perceived to be Palestinians, and Arabs and Muslims here in the United States in the context of the slaughter in Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined for this segment by Abed Ayoub, who's the executive director of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. Abed, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's an honor to have you here with us. And I guess I was just hoping to ask you first. I mean, obviously, the shooting of these 3 young students in Vermont, I think, has just been something that's captured all of us. But I wanted to start maybe by taking one step back. I mean, what have we really seen since October 7th in terms of increases or spikes in terms of discrimination against those that people perceive to be Arab Americans?
It's been we have seen a drastic rise and an increase, but I want to say the numbers don't tell the full story, right? And I know we've had a lot of comparisons with post 9/11 and what we're seeing now. The main difference is in the types of attacks and the types of incidents that are targeting the community. Post 9/11, you had your regular, run-of-the-mill discrimination or somebody being harassed at a supermarket or being bullied at school, and we're not minimizing those, but these are the types of things we saw in the community with the hate crimes. This time around, it's sophisticated and it's very planned. So the attacks against the community didn't just happen, organically. As there was a switch that turned on that began with trying to silence, doctors, attorneys, and professionals by going after them at the workplace, reaching out their employers to make an example out of them. So if they can make an example out of these professionals, get them fired. They wanted to, again, silence the community, put fear in the community, and then couple that with the language that was being used, the dehumanizing language that was being used, is still being used by a lot of the elected officials, including the president, during the early days of October, and the attack on our student groups. So we were getting and still getting hit in every direction. Yes, we can give you the numbers. There's been thousands of intakes between the major Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim organizations that we've counted. There's been hundreds of our community members that have been fired. But the way these happen and the way they're happening is very problematic. And all of that culminates with the general public, the people that are watching all of this happening, dehumanizing us, thinking it's okay to speak this way or it's okay to hate Arabs, to hate Palestinians. That's why you have a 6-year-old in Chicago that was stabbed and killed, and his mother was also stabbed. That's why you have 3 Palestinian students, in Vermont who were shot, because the language and the climate is bad, and contributing to that is the way these attacks and the way these have been planned against us.
Abed, you've been working on this sort of thing for a very long time, and this does seem quite unprecedented. I mean, I'm not in the States, but just from what I've seen from abroad, it's quite shocking to witness some of the open displays of racism. But it's not just, I mean, you're mentioning that this is coming from somewhere, right? Like, obviously people are being incited because Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims are being dehumanized in the media, as well as by officials. I mean, I think it was really shocking to all of us to see this gentleman who in New York City was repeatedly going and harassing this cart vendor knowing he was being videotaped and just openly calling for more deaths of Palestinian children, saying that at that point 4,000 hadn't been enough. And it turned out he had worked for the State Department. And I could be wrong. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but up until now, I have not heard a condemnation for. I know he was ultimately arrested and charged, but I heard no condemnation from any official in the Biden administration or anybody who worked with him in the Obama administration. I mean, this wasn't just some middleman. This was somebody who was in charge of the Israeli-Palestinian file in the State Department at one point, I believe, under Obama. He had won several awards at the State Department. And I think this speaks to a really serious issue in the highest echelons of power in the United States. I mean, what are Arab Americans supposed to do under these circumstances when the people in charge of not just Republicans who we're used to hearing genocidal rhetoric from, but from Democrats who are always talking about inclusion and equality and diversity, when they're the ones also saying these things that are basically not only dismissing the fact that Arab Americans have a basic right to be treated as, citizens of their country with human rights, but also they're engaging in dehumanizing and in some cases you could say genocidal rhetoric.
You're right. You're absolutely right. There's been no condemnation from the State Department, the Obama administration, or anybody that we've heard of come out against this guy. And an important point you touch on, this is not only from the Republican Party or conservatives. This is the hate is coming from it's bipartisan hate. We're calling it, like, it's coming from all directions. It's not isolated to like one geographical area. You're seeing it happen in New York. You're seeing it happen in the South and in other parts of the country. So it is, again, it's not an isolated thing. And it's not, we are seeing it coming from Democrats that are contributing to this, and coming from, progressives and liberals that aren't really, willing to stand up with Palestinians, willing to stand up with Arabs, and are contributing to the rhetoric. The issue we had within a week or two, we immediately felt, actually sooner than a week, like we felt abandoned, where a lot of the allies that were marching in 2017 with, going to the airports, and a lot of these larger, organizations based out here in DC that were ready to stand with the Muslim community, with the Arab community, they were nowhere to be found. They were silent and would not return phone calls, would not engage, even though we warned them about the impeding hate crimes. Everything started on October 7th. By October 8th or 9th, we were emailing all our partners, our government partners, saying hate crimes are going to rise. We're going to see some attacks against our community. We need to start working together to preempt this and get ahead of this. There was no responses. The only response, the only time we began receiving responses was when Wadea was stabbed in Chicago. That's when people realized, okay, this is this isn't BS. Things are really happening. We need to pay attention. But it's at that point it was already too late. It's already going, and it has not slowed down. We're seeing it happen again all over the country. We saw the shooting in Vermont this past weekend, and unfortunately, I believe we're going to see even more in the coming future targeting our community. So it's a tough time right now in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it really is amazing. And I mean, it seems to me also that there's an element of this that, well, one, it just strikes me as deeply paternalistic in some ways now, as sort of, people coming out now that the elections, it looks like people are saying, oh, we don't want to vote for this person or vote for that person. Now, all of a sudden, you see a lot of the politicians mouthing the words, oh, well, we're against this and we're against that. But it seems to me that one other issue here is, this to some degree is sort of, reality based. And so on the one hand, you have the Biden administration rolling out initiatives saying they're against Islamophobia, but still unwilling to really aggressively push for a ceasefire. And it almost seems that, in some ways, they want to have their cake and eat it too, a lot of these officials, is they want to say, well, we care so much now they care so much, about how our constituents are feeling, but they don't also want to address more deeply the causes of what is making this hatred rise to such a high degree. And it almost feels, to me, it just feels like when, for just myself, during the 2020 uprising, when people say, well, we care so much about racism, but then they don't want to seriously address the issue of what the police are doing in our community. It feels like this is kind of a similar issue with how on the one hand, I'll say I'm against Islamophobia, against anti-Arab hate, but then on the same token, you want to say, but I'm actually 100% for this war continuing and this slaughter continuing in Gaza.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And the rollout of the Islamophobia strategy, that's a whole other problem, which you can have a whole show, dedicated to it, right? We know it was rolled out when the poll numbers started dropping. All of a sudden, you see this program rolled out that's been working on for a year, and then that program within itself even has issues. Is how is the U.S. government is one of the biggest perpetrators of Islamophobia. So how are they supposed to hold a countering Islamophobia measure when they're engaging in it regularly through their policies and through their implementations of different programs they have? And they're basically absolving themselves of any role by having this a strategy and trying to address it. Well, you have to look internally, and we know how you can get rid of Islamophobia. We know the programs you can remove and the rhetorics you can start changing and putting an end to these wars, and we can go on and on ways that can do that. So we don't see much value in the strategy, and in fact, it may be more, even more harmful to the community than helpful. But yes, the poll numbers start dropping. People now are starting to talk about the elections, but as we've been saying, I've been saying, publicly on my social media channels, it's kind of too late. I mean, 2024 is going to be a brutal year for Democrats. They've underestimated the impact this genocide is going to have on the community. Early on, I was told, directly that your community will forget, your community won't remember. Who are you going to vote for? Trump. Look at the alternative. But things like that don't scare the community anymore. Threatening with the Muslim ban, threatening with a lot of these policies, they don't have an impact on the community anymore. And it's going to be an interesting year next year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious when we talk about the sort of anti-Arab hate that we're seeing. I mean, I think it's obviously a scale, right? So like on one side, you have the actual violent attacks against people. In this case, the 3 students who were shot in Vermont, the child that was stabbed in Chicago. These are like the very sort of serious sorts of hate crimes that you see get reported on. There's a lot that doesn't get reported on. Just to throw out an example, like I have a relative who, like, this isn't a hate crime, but it's just the harassment that people are dealing with. He's like a 13-year-old and he got called a terrorist by some white kids at school because he was trying to add some nuance to the conversation about what's happening in Palestine. So it's like, there's that, all the way to actual violence. So I'm just curious if you could, and then you mentioned firings, people being fired for just expressing support for Palestine. I'm curious if you can maybe break down a bit of the kinds of things that you're hearing that is being reported for the sort of anti-Arab harassment, bigotry, hate, violence that people in the Arab American community are dealing with right now.
Sure, and thank you. That was a good, kind of rundown and explanation that there are things that are not reported, things that don't make the headlines, and this is what we hear, and we hear, these examples daily. You have first on the college campuses the doxing of the students, the silencing of our student groups. You have a lot of students that are being pressured into redacting statements, taking posts down. And most times, the students don't want to deal with the headache, or they don't want to deal with, going through a process. They cave in. But that's been starting to change over the past few weeks. A lot of students are starting to fight back. They're starting to understand their rights, and they're starting to understand they can't be silenced. That's a good thing. The most troubling are the things that are happening in elementary schools and in high schools across the country on a very regular basis. And it's not from other students. Most of the times it's from other teachers. There's a local school district out here in the DC area where, teachers have made clearly anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian comments, but there's no reprimand. They're not held responsible for it. And the administration does anything they can to keep it quiet and, maybe issue an apology directly to the students, but won't address it publicly. Then in the workplace, you have, again, the targeting of employees, the firing of employees, people getting laid off. That is happening, often, or people being threatened, if you don't take this post on, you're going to be fired. It's just continuous. None of these are, they don't rise to the level like, wow, this is such crazy facts. They're all very similar in how they play out because it's very coordinated. It is very sophisticated. There is a game plan for this. It's well funded. It's all tied into, again, silencing us, identifying who we are, identifying who speaks up, going on LinkedIn, emailing their HR bosses or their direct supervisors, and then it just starts going from there. And it is happening daily, and it's going to continue happening.
Well, let me ask you this before we let you go, because we know that people, as you said, are increasingly not allowing themselves to be silent. I know you guys at ADC are right there on the front lines of this. I mean, what are some of the things that people are doing to push back against this rise in hatred, and how can those who want to help intersect with those efforts?
Absolutely. The one thing we're doing, what we're starting to do is we have to be aggressive. We have to go on the offensive. That's why we've made a commitment to, hold those accountable, not, that are perpetrating the hate, not only through criminal charges, but we're going to start pursuing civil actions. We have a number of lawsuits that are lined up. We represent the family of the 6-year-old and the mom of the 6-year-old that was stabbed in Chicago with attorney Ben Crump, and hope to file a civil lawsuit against the person that stabbed him and killed him. We have a number of other civil actions and civil lawsuits lined up, because we got to, in this country, you have to send a message. And if we can make people pay, hopefully that's a deterrent in the future. And then those that have been fired are also looking into legal actions. And it's time we get mature, and it's time we organize around taking advantage of, the civil court system we have here, holding people accountable, making them pay for their actions. Even though if they don't face criminal charges, let's at least put them through civil court and have them pay up and have them learn a lesson that they can't act this way and they can't target us this way.
Abed Ayoub, Executive Director of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, thank you so much for giving us some of your time
both.
Here in the Freedom Side.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Take care.
Oh, Eugene, it's really, outrageous that on top of like what you have to deal with from all these American officials inciting this hatred, you have this entire pro-Israel lobbying apparatus that is, like Abed mentioned, very, very well funded, and is committed to silencing and censoring and punishing Arab and Muslim Americans for speaking up for their people.
Yes.
In the midst of a genocide.
Yes.
It's just completely outrageous. Like I can't tell you how many relatives I hear from regularly in the US who are just like, they can't even post to their Instagram stories because what if my boss sees? What if my coworker sees? I might lose my job. There's, we talk about being a country that cares about free speech. I can't, what Arabs, and I know more than just Arabs are dealing with this, but like people who's in some cases Palestinian, their families are in Gaza and they can't even say anything publicly because it might hurt their job prospects. I mean, that's where we're at. You just have to
100%.
Silently watch your people be genocided.
Yeah, I mean, I think and it was, I think he spoke to it very clearly. A lot of people who were out there in 2017 about the Muslim ban have nothing to say here. It's like if it can fit into a liberal narrative about the Republicans, about Trump or whatever, then it's fine, But just like Palestinians in a way are much more accepted when they're just sort of the passive victims. I think Arab Americans, or people perceived to be Arab American and perceived to be Muslim, who are on the receiving end of so much of this discrimination, if you're sort of a passive victim of an evil, obviously racist actor like Trump, then it's all fine. But, then when you want to assert that, hey, maybe there's something else to this story that our community can bring to the table, then all of a sudden you become a problem. And I think it speaks to a lot of the so-called, anti-racist politics that's really less than skin deep with a lot of these Democratic Party politicians. It's really a shame. And to see these three, gentlemen who were shot there in Vermont, but I have to say they've been, at least one of them has put out some very strong statements, and I have to say it's very heartening to see that even one of the individuals who may never walk again, continuing to advocate for the rights of Palestinian and Arab people here to speak up on this genocide in Gaza. So we'll have to continue to cover this and continue to watch this. We are going to move the agenda here, and well, this is certainly a related phenomenon. It's like the far right surging everywhere, and all of them are using this opportunity to pay fealty to Israel. Javier Milei says he's actually going to convert to Judaism, the new president of Argentina. But nonetheless, to help put all this in context, we are very happy to be joined once again by the very worldly Zoe Alexandra, journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm happy that you decided to come on the show. I know we gave you quite the brief here, but from Geert Wilders to Javier Milei, it seems that we have this sort of rising trend around the world again of the far right, all trying to kind of capitalize right now, of course, as well on their bona fides vis-a-vis Israel. So that's not really a question, but maybe tell me what you think about that.
It's definitely an interesting phenomenon. I mean, on one hand, the rise of the right is something that we've been seeing for the past several years. We've seen kind of how neoliberalism has destroyed the working class across the world and how far-right leaders have really filled that vacuum. Argentina is an extremely, poignant example of that. I'll be honest. I think the fealty to Israel and the kind of extreme running towards the Zionist lobby, it's logical. It makes sense in terms of political orientation. But I will say it does seem, I guess it's not surprising for the moment, but I don't know if we've seen this sort of pivot, this really hard pivot in recent times, and especially from the far right. Given that they often have quite anti-Semitic politics. And of course, just goes to show that actually Zionism is not about Judaism, even more so. But when you have someone like Javier Milei, he's clearly, I think, isolated, and he sees the possibility of allying with Israel at a moment where Israel is actually quite isolated on the international stage, probably as an opportunity for some sort of insulation. He's not super far thinking and doesn't necessarily have that kind of medium-term strategic vision, which is clearly why he wants to dollarize the economy and dissolve the central bank. But I think he sees this as sort of a short-term buoy in terms of like, okay, how do I most quickly get on the side of the United States? And then I think with the case of our of the fellow in the Netherlands, who's still kind of he did win many seats in the snap elections. Unclear how the building of that ruling coalition will happen, but this does seem sort of in line with really across the political spectrum in Europe. Very, very few voices are speaking out against Israel. We saw Ursula von Leyen in the early days of Israel's genocidal attacks on Gaza, that she was standing firm, standing in Israel, having a huge projection of the Israeli flag onto, I think, the building of the European Union. So that is definitely in lockstep. But I think that the Javier Milei trend is definitely like a new development that's pretty wild, to be quite honest.
It is really wild, and I am a bit curious about like how this necessarily happened, because it wasn't entirely expected, but it's also happening in conjunction with what we've seen as mentioned in the Netherlands, where you have the rise of Geert Wilders again, but in a more serious capacity. Can you talk a bit about that and maybe how this fits into a broader trend in certain countries, at least? Of this kind of rise of the far right in a particular time in history, I would say.
Definitely. And, I will acknowledge publicly here that when we talked about the Argentinian elections on this very show, I felt quite confident that Javier Milei would not win these elections due to his really outlandish positions, his clear attacks on the fundamental rights of the Argentinian people. And I think myself and many others standed corrected with his victory. But I think that, to kind of bring it back to your question, what that highlights is just the utter devastation to the livelihoods, towards the survival of working class people in Argentina. And, as we can see an extension really across the world from neoliberalism, and I mean, in really every aspect of life. So in the case of Argentina, we're not just talking about the devastation to the Argentine peso and the inability of you to know, for example, from one day to the next, how much is your food going to cost to feed your family because of the rapid devaluation of the currency, paired with crazily high levels of inflation. We're talking about not having access to any full-time jobs where you're guaranteed benefits or any sort of stability at the same time that the jobs in the government are being decreased, labor rights are being whittled down to next to nothing. And so this is the context that's, of course, this happened in Argentina, where we saw a huge devastation of the population, their socioeconomic conditions. Of course, under Mauricio Macri, who imposed very harsh austerity measures, and on top of that, took out billions of dollar loans from the IMF, which further, of course, called for the cutting of ministries, called for raising the price of basic services like electricity and heating and other such things. And this saw 40% of the population being kind of plunged into poverty, an increase in homelessness. And that's the context. That's really the context within which figures like Milei emerge, where people's very social fabric is destroyed, because when you don't have access to food, when you don't know how you're going to feed your families, when you don't have any sort of possibility of a stable job that also has a huge, huge impact on, again, this social community life, on people's kind of ability to trust in the government, to trust in any sort of institution to provide you with any sort of stability. And so this is, of course, a socioeconomic phenomenon that we've seen in Argentina, in many countries across South America, but really across the entire world, and especially in Europe, which has gotten way worse, of course, with the war in Ukraine, where we've seen the cost of living crisis get even worse, where gas prices are increasing, electricity is increasing, all sorts of things are getting more expensive, and politicians don't really have a strong response to them. And so that is where people like Javier Milei come in with their tirades against the political caste that put the people in this situation, and really calling on people's pride, saying, are you going to let them do this to you? These sorts of provocations, and really speaking to this kind of vulnerable side of people that feel scared, that feel like they don't have any sort of security. So I think, going from the local to the broader to the international, I think this is, of course, with each country having its own specificities. Of course, in Europe, you have much more of the phenomenon playing on xenophobia, on racism. In the Netherlands, this has been a huge, huge, huge issue. Wilders is more xenophobic than the rest of the candidates. That clearly put him in better standing, saying migrants are responsible for every single possible issue that anyone could be facing in the country, whether, having no explanation for people's socioeconomic conditions besides it's the problem of migrants, it's the problem of refugees. So these are sort of the broad trends, and then with these specific elements of each country's context. But these right-wing leaders are just capitalizing on these deep-seated fears, for sure.
Yeah, no, I think one of Geert Wilders' campaign points was to close all mosques, which just, if you couldn't be any clearer than that, no doubt about it. But I mean, as we were talking earlier about Henry Kissinger and sort of the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. And it's hard for me to look at, especially a country like Argentina, especially someone like Javier Milei linking with Israel here, or at least attempting to. It's hard not to flash back a little bit to the Reagan era, and the use of the dirty war, the military dictatorships in Argentina, going hand in hand, of course, with the use of Israel, obviously, in the Middle East, and of course, always connections between the Contras and the apartheid South Africans and the military governments in Latin America. And it just feels in this moment of we've talked so much on this show about the changes in Latin America, especially the shifts in order to the left, and it just, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this here, but it just feels like that strategy of containment from that, 40 years ago, sort of a similar script playing out here.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen Milei speak specifically against, for example, other leaders in the region. He's gone on tirades against Andrés Manuel López Obrador. We see a huge contrast between Milei, for example, and Gustavo Petro, who since October 7th has been advocating for the Palestinian cause, advocating for an end to apartheid, for an end to Israeli occupation of Palestine. He's someone who definitely represents this kind of new wave, who's spoken out actually precisely about Israel's support to the militaries across Latin America, to Israel's complicity in human rights violations that have taken place across Latin America. So I think someone like Milei, who, connecting it again to the 70s Operation Condor moment, Milei is someone who says that human rights are an invention of people to gain money and to spread lies and to do criminal activities. He says that the 30,000 detained and disappeared during the dictatorship in Argentina, that's a fake number, that people are making this up, that this is a crazy crusade of these false human rights advocates. And so it definitely makes sense that all of these threads are kind of lining up. But I think that the general trend is not in that direction. I think that Milei, again, is extremely isolated. He has insane campaign promises. As I said before, dissolve the central bank, cut basically every ministry, which threatens really so many aspects of functioning in Argentina. But in addition to these ridiculous local and domestic policies, his international policies of cutting ties with Brazil and China, leaving all sort of regional integration platforms, now pledging all of this loyalty to Israel. But I think maybe he doesn't know it, but I think that we can see that he's really on a sinking ship, much like many of the supporters of Israel now see that the entire world is turning against Israel and the Zionist project right now. This is not a project of life, of future, of hope. It's a project that is trying to bring, regression and a politics of death. And I think that Milei has this short-term vision that this might give him a little leverage with the United States. It might give him that crucial support. But I think ultimately that's not really the direction the world is going in. And like many of his plans, it's not going to go anywhere fast.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe, as always, it's an honor to have you here. Well, we already
Hi,
switched
Zoe.
to Kambale here before we had to. Okay. Zoe, it's an honor to have you here. I just wanted you, since I get it wrong every single time, to give us the correct information for how people can view Give the People What They Want, which is a fantastic weekly roundup show from People's Dispatch.
Well, first, I encourage everyone on a daily basis, go to peoplesdispatch.org, get caught up on pressing international movement news, analysis, updates. And then every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, it switches for Indian time because, there's daylight savings time. Check out Give the People What They Want with myself, Vijay Prashad, and Prashanth from People's Dispatch, giving you all the latest updates on your weekly news.
Indeed. Couldn't recommend it any higher. Peoplesdispatch.org. Give the people what they want Fridays at 11 a.m., not 10:30, although you're happy to go wait on their YouTube page. Zoe Alexandra, co-editor of People's Dispatch, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, you missed it. The screen went kind of black.
Oh, I did miss it. I was checking something.
You literally looked down for a moment and came back. I swear it happened. I'm not making it up. Anyway, that was a fun little preview. Yeah, it's very disappointing, especially when you consider the trend in the rest of Latin America right now, which has been not to the right, that you start to see something like that happen again. But it's important to put it in the global context because, I think Zoe did a really good job of breaking it down. But this is when you have a crisis of capitalism like we see around the world right now, it can go one of two ways.
Yeah, definitely. And it is going in different ways, and it's more chaotic as there's no real solution, which, well, there's more to say about that, and we'll continue to discuss it. But nonetheless, yes, I think a very distressing reality. Hopefully, Geert Wilders won't actually make it into the prime ministership, but we shall see. Now we want to turn our attention to the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Lots of people, of course, have started talking more about the Congo, thankfully, in conjunction with what we've seen in Palestine, or telling people, since they're talking about Palestine, they should also be talking about Congo. That's been the rise in interest. So we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Kambale Musavuli, who's an analyst with the Center for Research on the Congo-Kinshasa. Kambale, as always, thanks so much for being with us, man.
Thank you for continuing to cover the situation in the Congo.
Well, I just want to start by asking you, I mean, obviously a large number of people have been saying, hey, Palestine, definitely good to focus on Palestine, but don't forget what's happening in Congo. I'm curious, just as someone who's been working on this issue for a long time, how does it feel to have this increased interest? And do you feel that there is sort of a twinning of the issue, that they do go together in terms of how we should be having our discussions about them?
I mean, it's a good thing for people to worry about the situation in the Congo. My only worry around it has been to compare it to Palestine for two reasons. One, I do know that Palestinians have always been in solidarity with the Congolese. I myself have worked with Palestinians on the situation in the Congo, specifically the students at Berzit University. They've organized Congo Week in the middle of the occupation, in the oppression that they're facing by the Israeli forces. They are still speaking up about the situation in the Congo. And I've worked with Palestinians also in New York City while I was there. They organized Occupy Peter Grossman's lawn. Peter Grossman is an American businessman who has a hedge fund, which is actually a virtual fund. And he was trying to collect a penny on a dollar on a loan that he purchased from Yugoslavia. Of course, Yugoslavia as a state does not exist anymore. But he was trying to collect, I think he bought the debt for about $3 million. He was trying to get about $100 million from it. Palestinian organized a protest in front of his house in Fort Greene, right in Brooklyn, right? So I've seen that happen. So but also it's important, as we discuss, the interest is to actually understand that the same oppression that's happening in Palestine has also some roots in DRC. So if we look at, for example, the Israeli billionaire, Dan Gertler, who's made his billions of exploiting the Congolese people, some of the money that is made out of DRC has been used to build settlements in the occupied territories of Palestine. Most people don't even know that, right? His lawyers who represented him to put pressure on the Biden administration to remove U.S. sanctions on him, that lawyer, I think his name is Alan, I forgot how to mention his last name, is the same lawyer who defended Donald Trump during the impeachment, right? And I can go on and on in speaking about the same oppression, but what I've noticed that's being lost in the discussion when I'm comparing Prime Minister Netanyahu to Rwandan President Paul Kagame. These two politicians, right, are committing crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and no one is holding them accountable, right? When I'm thinking about the occupation of lands in different parts of the DRC, I'm seeing the same thing there. So as we're discussing the situation in the Congo, the struggle of both people in Palestine and in DRC is control of their land and resources. They want sovereignty. They want to be treated as human beings. They don't want to be removed from the land and finding themselves as refugees. Palestinians have been displaced for 75 years. DRC, according to the latest number last month, coming from the UN and the World Food Program, is that we have 7.9 million Congolese who've been displaced in the conflict in DRC. So the roots of the conflict may seem different, but in the end, the resistance of both people are the same, and we should support the Congolese people in the struggle for regaining sovereignty of the land, the same as we support the Palestinian people as well.
And Kambale, for those who maybe aren't aware of the specifics of what's going on in the Congo, oftentimes, of course, it's not oftentimes, almost always, it's presented in the Western corporate press as just the way a lot of conflicts in any part of the global South are presented as, oh, militias are just like killing each other. We don't really know why. They're just brown and black people. That's what they do. We don't know anything beyond that. But of course, there is a deeper reason for what's happening. There's been a lot of displaced people being displaced more recently because of one particular militia. I guess, let me put it this way for our American audience, what are the U.S. hands in the Congo through various proxies here? What's going on in I guess, a brief and easy way to understand that isn't just, Black people are being violent in some African country.
The simplification of this complex issue presented sometimes by the media is like this. Congo has known a conflict since 1996. And this conflict is being waged by two of Congo's neighbors who are US and British allies on the so-called war on terror. These two neighbors are Rwanda and Uganda. They invaded the Congo in 96. They invaded the Congo in 98. And up until today, even though peace accord has been signed, they continue to support proxy rebel militias in DRC. Why? Congo is a land endowed with so much mineral resources, right? We have gold, we have cobalt, we have coltan, we have tin, we have diamonds, right? The wealth of the DRC has been the source of some of the conflict that we see in DRC. And these two Congo's neighbors, they've invaded the Congo, they've occupied territories. Even worse, if I remember correctly, in around 1999 and also in 2001, these two nations actually fought each other on Congolese soil, right? Rwanda and Uganda actually fought each other on Congolese soil. You know why they fought each other in the Congo? They fought each other over a diamond mine. They both wanted control of a mine. And when they fought each other, they dropped 4,000 bombs in the city of Kisangani. This is what, and that conflict, we call it also the 6-Day War, where up until today, the victims of that conflict have never received any reparation or any justice, even though the United Nations issued the strong condemnation of the killings of Congolese. And fast forward to 2010, on October 1st, 2010, the UN High Commission for Human Rights published a report. This report is called the UN Mapping Exercise Report, calling what's happening in the Congo war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possible genocide if proven in a competent court. In that report, it identified that Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, and other forces committed crimes in DRC and singled out Rwanda for committing genocide in DRC. Can you imagine, 13 years after this report, there is still not an international tribunal for DRC. No one has been tried for these crimes, right? Beyond actually one Congolese warlord in Paris who was arrested on war crime charges, Lumbala, who I think about 2 years ago was arrested. Beyond him, no one has been held accountable. No multinationals documented by numerous UN reports have not been held accountable. So what the US has done in the conflict is, one, they've provided cover for the allies in the region. Documentation of Rwanda and Uganda's invasions exists. Yet, the US government every year continues to back Rwanda militarily, back Uganda militarily. Why? Some people may not know that you have Ugandan soldiers in Iraq, in Afghanistan. You have Rwandan soldiers playing interest operations across the African continent, and also France interests across the African continent, where you have Rwandan soldiers in Mozambique. You have Rwandan soldiers in Central African Republic. They were also at some time, years ago, they were in Mali under the UN missions there. So, but the US every year continue to give millions of dollars to these militaries, having the evidence that these countries are committing crimes in the DRC. So that's the US hands from the government side, but then from the corporation side, numerous reports have been published of US corporation and other international corporations who have pilfered illegally Congo's minerals. I think in 2002 actually, there was a report published by the UN group of experts documenting 85 companies illicitly trading or accessing Congo's minerals. Up until today, nothing happened to these companies. So there is a tacit support of the US to invaders, and there is complicity of the US by not holding companies and their allies accountable for crimes committed in the DRC.
Well, Kambale, one of the things that's coming up here relatively soon, at least potentially, is the elections for president in DRC. My timeline is filled with politicians, mobilizing their supporters and the like. I mean, give us a sense. Obviously, Felix Tshisekedi is seeking re-election of sort of who the players are in this election and what's at stake.
We have about 26 presidential candidates in DRC. Most of whom are, I'll say, professional politicians, right? And that's what they live on. Some of the top three contenders, one of them is a billionaire. His name is Moise Katumbi. He is a former governor of the province of Katanga. There are so many documentation, many of the corruption cases around him, the mining assets that he acquired, and how he used the state's apparatus to gain some of the contract that made him the wealthy man that he is. So he's running for office. He also has ties in Israel as well. The second runner-up is a man by the name of Fayulu. He's a former ExxonMobil executive, but he won the last presidential election, actually. Martin Fayulu is his name. Unfortunately, the declaration of the result did not present him as the winner because there was a secret deal between the former president Joseph Kabila and the current president Tshisekedi. And the third one is an interesting one. He's a doctor. He's a medical doctor, Denis Mukwege. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was actually nominated multiple times. I think the first time he was nominated was when Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. So which is interesting. I always make the comparison and say that you had a doctor who's treating victims of war, not winning the Nobel Peace Prize yet. A warmonger like Barack Obama was declared the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. But afterwards, of course, Dr. Mukwege won that. In terms of his credibility around his work, his medical work, this is a doctor who has literally stayed in the DRC and treated the victims of war, particularly the women who have been affected in the Congo. Many may know that as a tactic of war, many women in the DRC have been raped by militia groups as a way of displacing them and destroying even their livelihood. Many of them cannot even have children today. So this doctor specialized in fistula repair and was able to treat over 50,000 women in the region. So he has that credibility. He's not a politician. He does not have a base that can rally around it. Congo is a country of 100 million people, but he decided to run for office among the 26 million people. Who will win? It's up to the Congolese people to decide. But when you look at the process of the electoral process of what is actually happening now, every indication shows us that the elections will be rigged. Why am I saying that? We are going to elections and we don't even know how many people have registered to vote. So the numbers can be faked. We do not even know the polling stations, right? And we are 20 days to the election. Congo is a country the size of Western Europe, and they expect us to believe that going to the elections, we will change. But what I'm saying, regardless of what the government will do, what the politicians will do, there is a wave across the African continent. We've seen it in Sierra Leone, right? Just a week ago, there was an attempted coup. Why is there an attempted coup in Sierra Leone? In Gabon, the same thing. And as you start looking at Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, you are noticing that the African peoples are tired of bourgeois politics. They are tired of the lies of the politicians, and they are seeking alternatives. I will not be surprised after the elections or during the electoral process on December 20th, if the result does not reflect the will of the Congolese people, there may be a coup d'etat in the DRC, or even worse, the country could descend into war. But I'm still confident. The Congolese people, since 1960 to present, have shown that they are willing to put their lives on the line, their feet on the street, to transform the country. There is an opportunity for the regime to do the right thing. Indication shows that they will not do it, so they will have to face the brunt of the will of the people and what they'll decide to do on December 20th, 2023.
It's interesting you're talking about elections. I did see that the EU had canceled its election observation mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo due to what they call technical issues related to security. And perhaps that is the case. I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add about that. But you did mention some other African countries that recently have had popular coups, I guess we can call them. And I had you on my show, Dispatches Kambale, to talk about that a few months ago. And I'm just curious, obviously so much of the world's attention has shifted in the last, I guess, 2 months to the situation in Gaza and Israel's ongoing genocide. It's easy to forget the world before October 7th. There was this, these massive, these coups and these popular movements and uprisings across West Africa mostly. And you and I had talked about how there was momentum moving across the continent. And I'm just curious, very briefly, if perhaps we are a bit distracted by what's happening in Gaza. Is that momentum still taking place? We're not hearing as much about it. And, obviously this goes beyond West Africa or Congo or just any specific African country. But yeah, your thoughts on the fact that we were seeing a trend take place. And you just mentioned a potential coup that we could see take place in Congo if people continue to feel as though they're not having their voices heard in representation.
So for the European Union, they sent 40 observers about 2 weeks ago. And when they arrived, there is a process when you're electoral observer of what you have to check to make sure that it makes sense. Some of the two things that I mentioned, there is a whole list of things that show that there is a problem with the electoral process. But the two things that I mentioned, those are the most daring. Imagine that we are going into elections, we actually do not know who registered to vote, right? So if there are 20 million Congolese who registered to vote and results are published, then we can actually assess if the results are true or not. But we don't even have that number. The electoral cards of people who actually went to register to vote and got their electoral card, it's made in a way where their face disappear. Most of the people who have electoral cards do not have their faces on it anymore, because he has faded. This is not a defect of the machine. This is intentional, right? To actually print ID cards where the face of the voters are gone. So I think the European Union decided to not participate. I'm not really worrying about what the European Union is going to do in the DRC. I'm much more concerned about what other African countries are doing, or even the African Union are doing. Because the last election, 3 African countries affected our election. That was Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. These 3 countries were part of the secret deal between the former president, Kabila, and Felix Tshisekedi, so that he could rule and not actually go after Joseph Kabila, the former president of the DRC. So that was actually an African affair in effect affecting the elections. So coming to now, I'm worrying more about will the African Union, African people, actually engage in shining light on the issues, because that's what will make a difference. So now moving forward to the wave of change, right? It hasn't died down. A week ago, there was an attempted coup, right? We are in a time in Africa where the people of Africa, where the people of Africa are saying they are tired of the current regime process that they call democracy. And this democracy do not represent the popular democracy where the people have a say, right? Where we have the compradors of our countries making deals for their benefits and those who are around them, while the vast majority of the people are suffering. And in West Africa, most of the progressive forces were successful at educating the masses beyond the compradors. They were able to educate them about franc CFA, the currency. It's saying that how can we be in West Africa with a currency controlled by France? That's imperialism. Yes, we have our compradors, but that's tied to that. They were able to educate the population around foreign military presence in West Africa. How can we have French military bases all across West Africa, and we don't have a military base in France? And through that education, most of the people from young to old in West Africa became very clear. But when I saw the coup in Gabon, which is what I call a palace coup, where the military took control. That coup took place right after a rigged election. Ali Bongo, who organized an election that was completely rigged, right, played with fire. Well, the people were ready to transform, but the military took the time to take control of the state. So now when I'm looking at the Congo, I'm seeing every indication that we are going to have a crisis. The people of the Congo since 1962 now, all they are asking for, I could even say since 1885. Since 1885, the Congolese people have been in the pursuit of choosing their own leaders, of deciding for their destiny. Yet, what they keep finding since that time to now is outside interference, compromised collaboration with the region, and then position of decisions that don't reflect the people. In the Congo today, I just say 7.9 million people have been displaced in DRC. Over 6 million people have died. There is no peace, there is no justice, and we are going to an election that we know is going to be rigged. So there will be popular uprising. In the end, it will be now a challenge of finding out, will the result of the popular uprising bring about fundamental change? That can only be seen through the experience of the people themselves during that time. We don't know how we will end up. But what we know, there is a crisis. But I'm still confident. The country the size of Western Europe, where they say that its wealth is over $2 trillion, US and Europe GDP combined, right? That it is in turmoil today because they want Africa not to develop. The day Congo will be free, and that its wealth is harnessed for the development, not just of the Congo, but for the African continent, the African continent will be transformed. So the struggle of the Congolese, while they are struggling to choose their leaders, has to be connected to the larger Pan-African movement on the continent. That it's not just about the elections today, right? It's also about the young Congolese, where we had one of the biggest Congolese artists do a concert in Paris last week with 40,000 people coming in, right? And it's presented as historic, but the media is not saying that during that same time, in the same city, 2 days before the concert, Congolese youth organized a major protest in Paris. And people came out and they're organizing another one, right? That you have conscious Congolese who are fighting and organizing. So it's how do we tap into supporting the Congolese people who are trying to transform, while there may be distraction happening that will not allow us to see that Congolese people are a vibrant people who are fighting and wanting to transform the country.
Mm-hmm. Kambale Musavuli with the Center for Research on the Congo, Kinshasa. As always, it is a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much for your time on the freedom side.
Thank you, and we'll all be free on the freedom side.
Mm-hmm. Rania, anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I just think it's really important that we recognize that there are other conflicts happening in the world. It can be very easy to just focus on one at any given moment, but it's just wild the amount of people that have been displaced in Congo in just the past few weeks. I think it's something like I saw 450,000 in just the last few weeks alone. So anyways, I'm really glad that we have someone like Kambale who can come and break all that down. Given that, I mean, it's just disgusting, Eugene, the way it's reported in the media, the way so many conflicts are across the global South. It's just this like really distant, basic, racist understanding of what's happening in so many places where you can actually see the thread go right back to imperialism.
Indeed. Well, on that note, we're going to turn to the imperial politics of another country, Canada, and how that's intersecting with the struggle of the Palestinian people. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Sarah Abdelshami, who is an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you might be muted. Oh, we can't hear you. It might be on our end, too.
Well, hopefully we can get that figured out easily.
Yeah, we will.
Okay.
We will move on this, but yeah, no, I think your point's well taken. All of these different conflicts, which are critically important, and Congo, of course, which has been so washed out. I mean, obviously, initially in 1997, 1996, 1997, 98, there was a lot of focus on it, but it basically dropped out of the news since then. But the killing has not, and the situation of internally displaced people is obviously atrocious. You know, you go to places like Goma, which is in the eastern DRC. It's the sort of main city of that area on the north of Lake Kivu, and you know, hundreds of thousands of people living outdoors, not enough food, no real sanitation, all of this. And you know, I hate to sort of pit people against each other, because obviously all people who are refugees deserve to have decent standards of living. But you see what a lot of these countries, you know, people coming from Ukraine, it's like they're giving them huge sums of money. I mean, this money that's coming up potentially to be passed in the U.S. Congress has hundreds of millions of dollars for, you know, these refugees coming from Ukraine, and you don't see anything comparable in terms of, you know, what's going on to help people on the ground, the IDPs in places like DRC, and of course, you know, on top of that, the complicity. And I'll add, you know, Uganda, which was mentioned there. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to add that yet. We'll come back around to the issue of Uganda and Israel later. But we do have back with us Sarah Abdulshami from the Palestinian Youth Movement. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really an honor to have you. I think those who are, you know, followers of Breakthrough News had the opportunity to see some of the massive march in solidarity with Palestine in Ottawa this past weekend. But I guess, you know, for those of us watching in the United States, or, you know, Canada is always presented as sort of the kinder, gentler country in North America. So talk a little bit, if you could, about what Canada's, you know, relationship is to Israel.
Yeah. You know, I think first and foremost, to understand Canada's support for the Zionist state of Israel, it's actually really crucial to note that what we're seeing today is not just the culmination of 75 years of Zionist aggression, but it's actually the culmination of Western imperialism in the region at large, right? And that Canada is actually a central part of US-led imperialism. So Palestine has been under 100 years of occupation, first by the British and then by the Zionists. And Israel was actually created by the backing of the British Empire, and is now being backed by US imperialism with the support of Canada and the European Union. So I'm starting here because, you know, when we understand Zionism as a project of imperialism, we can better understand Canada, America, and Western countries' support for Israel at large. And specifically here in this context, which is, you know, the war on Gaza, you know, Canada has actually pledged its support for Israel's mass genocide of the Palestinian people in material, diplomatic, as well as military ways. So, in 2021, when Israel was attacking Gaza, Canada's arms exports to Israel increased by 33%, and they exported $26 million a year in military goods to Israel. So I actually want to pause here and kind of speak about two different, you know, companies. The first is Incas, which is a global conglomerate with multi-million-dollar contracts, and the headquarters are actually in Toronto. So the Israeli occupation forces and the Israeli police are both clients of this company. And this company sells remote-controlled weapons that are attached to tanks and armored vehicles. And this actually allowed soldiers to shoot weapons like machine guns, grenades, and cannons from the safety of their vehicles at a much faster rate than they would normally if they were to shoot them manually. And again, the headquarters are in Toronto. So another thing is, you know, one of Canada's largest banks, which is Scotiabank, has a $500 million investment in Elbit System, which, you know, we know all too well, is an Israeli company that arms Israel's genocide against Palestinians. So this is why over the past couple of weeks, we've seen people take up escalatory actions and block or even picket weapons manufacturing companies and banks that are invested in weapons manufacturing, including both Incas and Scotiabank. And, you know, the longer that this genocide has gone on for, the more diverse the companies that activists target become. And, you know, this just goes to show that there's a long, long list of silent killers that are in our own backyards. And of course, aside from the weapons export, Canada plays a really critical diplomatic role in supporting Israel. So we saw this on October 27. Canada actually voted to abstain on a UN General Assembly resolution that was calling for a ceasefire. And this is pretty consistent with the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's continued refusal to call for a ceasefire, despite, activists across the country from coast to coast protesting his presence, in front of conferences, mosques, restaurants, public appearances, etc. And in addition to all of this, we also see that, just as in all imperialist nations, the media in Canada also serves the interests of the ruling class. We have media outlets here that are essentially working overtime to build public support for Israel's genocide against Palestinian people. And we've also seen people starting to demonstrate in front of these media institutions and conglomerates because people and the masses are identifying them as being complicit in this genocide. And, this is especially true in light of CTV's internal Palestine policy, which essentially it dictates that journalists should avoid using the word Palestine. And, other journalists have come out to say that there's, a culture of fear that is being cultivated inside these media outlets, specifically CTV, that is suppressing the critical coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. So, we see most mainstream outlets using terminologies like Israel-Hamas war, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, Palestinians die, but Israelis are killed. And, this is all part of a broader campaign, not just of deterring people from participating in displays, in public displays of support for Palestinian freedom, but it's a wider campaign of manufacturing consent and building public support for this genocide. But, despite all of this, despite the Canadian political class and the media's best efforts, over 71% of Canadians supported a ceasefire as of mid-November. And organizers across the country, including the Palestinian youth movement, we've been working very hard to build a mass movement that confronts Canada's complicity in the Israeli genocide and explicitly tries to shatter this perception of Canada as, like you said, the US's nice neighbor. And, we're working to organize the masses in a way that actually reflects this reality, which is, the Canadian imperialism continues to benefit from this genocide and the surveillance and repression of Palestinian communities and movements right here in North America.
I mean, there's something to be said that so many of these settler colonies around the world are Israel's biggest supporters, whether we're talking about the US or Canada or Australia. But, I'm curious, as we've seen in the United States, this play out domestically, at least, where you just have this wave of repression and censorship and people's livelihoods being threatened for speaking out, specifically targeting the Arab community, the Muslim community. I imagine there's something probably similar happening in Canada, despite the fact that we like to think our neighbors up north are somehow more civilized than the U.S. Is that something that people are dealing with as well in Canada, whether we're talking about in their workplaces, on college campuses, issues of harassment? I don't know if there's been any issues of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim violence, but if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah. Absolutely. For as much support as we've seen across the country from coast to coast, we've also seen since October 7 efforts to magnify repression and defamation of Palestinian organizations and generally just of support of Palestine, right? So I'll give a couple of examples. So we have B'nai B'rith, right, which is a rabid right-wing, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab group that has, pretty actively carried out campaigns and released statements that target Palestinian grassroots organizations. In the statement, B'nai B'rith wrote, with the support of Canadian politicians, urging Canadian police across the nation to shut down protests for Palestinian freedom that are taking place in Toronto, in Montreal, in Ottawa, and in Vancouver. And they actually vilified the rallies as, material support for Hamas. So these kinds of statements have a clear function, okay? Like, the function is that they want to criminalize mass movements of people who are standing against the Israeli-led genocide. They want to wreak havoc across Palestinian communities, and they, most importantly, want to increase state surveillance and repression, which according to the National Council of Canadian Muslim, we've actually seen 1,300% increase in the number of hate incidents towards the Palestinian and Muslim communities in Canada since October 7th. In Montreal, which is where I'm based, a woman with a Palestinian flag on her car was verbally harassed by a pro-Israel woman who identified herself as Lauren Wise. And, Lauren Wise then proceeded to hit the woman's car twice before driving away. In Calgary, a protester was arrested and charged with hate-motivated disturbance for chanting "From the river to the sea." So this is signaling an increase in police surveillance and suppression in an active attempt to deter people from participating in mass and public displays in support for Palestine. Of course, we also need to highlight what's happening in the university campuses in Canadian universities, because students are actually facing an unbelievable amount of repression. So at McGill University, for example, there was a pro-Palestine policy that was endorsed by 78% of the student body, which was, with a record-breaking voter turnout. And this policy is called the Policy Against Genocide, and it demanded that McGill University cut ties with institutions, corporations, and donors that are complicit in Zionism. A few days later, the administration put out a statement condemning this policy, and a Quebec Superior Court halted the adoption of this policy, which is a crazy escalation, right? B'nai B'rith also filed an injunction to stop the student union from adopting this policy. In the same city, in Montreal, a Concordia University, there's a lawsuit that is being filed against the university and the student union that actively is painting pro-Palestine students and events that happen on campus as being anti-Semitic. So, really what we're seeing is imperialist agents scrambling, and they're trying as best as they can to suppress and contain the mass support that we are seeing happening across every sector in Canada. And so we're seeing concerted efforts on university campuses, in workplaces, where people are getting fired on the electoral level, with Sarah Jama, who's an MPP, who was fired for stating her solidarity with the Palestinian people. And Sarah Jama was actually, she actually spoke at the National March on Ottawa, and the same students that are facing repression have been organizing weekly events on their campuses and outside of their campuses, organizing student contingents. The people who are getting fired are pursuing legal action against their employers. So people are not capitulating to fear. So as much as there's backlash, there's also, quite honestly, been an incredible level of bravery that the masses are expressing in the face of this repression.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Sarah, before we let you go, I also just want to ask you, many people did, of course, see the large demonstration that took place there in Ottawa this past weekend, but if you could just talk a little bit more, what have we seen in terms of solidarity with the Palestinian people in Canada? We've had a huge wave around the world. I assume it's a similar situation there.
Yeah. The demonstration in Ottawa was on November 25th, and it really was a historic day. People from all over Canada in cities like Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, Alberta, and, other neighboring and surrounding cities took buses, booked trains, they flew or they drove to the capital of Canada for what was the largest pro-Palestinian demonstration in Canadian history. So we all convened at the foot of Parliament Hill, where 100,000 people were standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And, part of what makes this demonstration so significant and powerful is that it actually came at the heels of the humanitarian pause, which Western countries, they've been largely framing as a solution to the war. But in reality, this pause is not a solution. And we know that the only thing that, will end this bloodshed is a permanent ceasefire, the lifting of the siege on Gaza, the release of our prisoners, and an end to Western complicity. And of course, an end to this occupation. So what this national march showed is that the Canadian masses are not fooled by and are not going to be placated by, this so-called humanitarian pause. And that is precisely why 100,000 people in Canada took to Parliament Hill. And it was to make our demands very clear, to say that we see through this hypocrisy. And, we know that 5 days is not enough to bury our dead, to mourn the lives of the over 20,000 people killed. It's not enough to recover people who are still under the rubble. People need to be treated. Thousands of injured civilians need to be treated. And after this pause, Gaza will still be under a land, air, and sea blockade, as it has been for 16 years, where Israel controls everything that goes in and out. Gaza's infrastructure has been completely leveled. They're going to be needing an extraordinary amount of medical aid and access to building materials to actually be able to rebuild their lives and rebuild their homes that have all been destroyed. So, the first thing I kind of want to say is that this upsurge that we're seeing of mass support for the Palestinian struggle for liberation is, partly because the genocidal nature of the Israeli state has become undeniable. We're seeing a state that made the decision to murder 20,000 people because of the humiliating military defeat that they suffered at the hands of the Palestinian people. The prisoner exchange that we're seeing take place now was on the table on October 8th. And yet Israel chose to wreak death and destruction on Gaza and achieve none of its military goals. So we're also seeing collective punishment that's currently happening across the West Bank, where a number of Palestinian prisoners that are kept hostage in Israeli jails have nearly doubled in just under a month. And here, I want to refer to them as hostages because a significant number of the 8,300 prisoners are held under what we call administrative detention, which basically means that there is no charge, no trial, and you're held for an indefinite amount of time. So ultimately, we've reached a place where you can no longer deny these extraordinary acts of brutality and aggression, and we can no longer deny that it speaks to the genocidal nature of Israel. It's not an accident. It's actually a part of it, right? And then the last thing, or the second thing I wanted to say about this is that, what we're seeing is not just an upsurge of mass support for the Palestinian struggle. We're actually witnessing something much deeper and much more powerful. We're witnessing a shift in mass consciousness globally, right? So what the National March in Ottawa showed us is that the people are recognizing the contradictions. They are recognizing that the so-called democratic countries like the US and Canada are supporting this genocide. And these are countries that have never hesitated before to sanction countries, to place them under embargoes. If we look at Cuba, for example, Cuba has been under decades-long policies of economic embargoes at the hands of the U.S. empire. And this embargo has a specific aim, which is to prevent Cuba from fully exercising its right to self-determination. And actually, this embargo amounts to an act of war. And despite the mounting pressure to remove the blockade, the U.S. continues its attack on Cuba precisely because they present a real threat to imperialism, not just in their region, but in the world. So here we're talking about, Western countries that have interfered in the political, economic, military, and domestic affairs of countless countries across the world, but especially in the global south. They have launched coups, they have placed them under embargoes, they have waged wars, all in the name of human rights and democracy. And yet, we are now seeing one of the most publicized and televised displays of genocide, images that are genuinely impossible to stomach, let alone, understand or process. And these same countries are refusing to even condemn the war crimes, let alone take active measures to or position to stop these war crimes. So, it's become really clear to the people of Canada and, of the world that these Western countries are loyal to not the so-called morals and values of democracy, but to their ideological and economic interests, which ultimately amounts to advancing the imperialist project across the globe. And, Palestine and the unity of the Palestinian movement in this moment is exposing the facade of Western imperialism. And it's showing the masses in Canada that, this government, doesn't serve our class interests.
Mm-hmm. Sarah Abdulshami, an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. We are very, very thankful for you giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Rania, I want to just move forward because our other guest has been waiting very patiently here, so I don't want to keep him waiting any longer. He's a very important person, That's Manolo De Los Santos, co-executive director of the People's Forum and researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, joining us to talk a little bit more about the global scene. Manolo, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Eugene and Rania.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you here. Many, many months ago, I remember we had you to talk about Ukraine. And one of the things we were talking about in that context was how much, the vast majority of the world was deeply at odds with the Western nations. And it seems, looking at the UN vote around the issue of a humanitarian truce or ceasefire, from what we've seen with the protests happening around the world, statements of the government, that this is yet another issue that reflects the erosion of U.S. Western hegemony on the global scene. Do you think that's a fair statement?
It's a completely precise statement. I would say, and add further, that what we are seeing right now is a global rebellion of the peoples of the South, who are pretty much, for the first time in 3 decades, trying to actually live out their sovereignty. They have independent policies that favor their own people. And I think in relationship to what's happened in Palestine, it's also a simple reaction to just the total distortion of the truth and reality that the U.S. and their ally Israel have put on the global stage. Who can look at what's happening in Palestine and think otherwise?
Yeah, Manolo, one way that I kind of see the reaction from the West and the global North to October 7th is this kind of visceral fear that they have of people in the global South hitting back at the garden, right? You have like the jungle people militarily shooting at the garden. I mean, look, I'm just using Joseph Borrell's language. I'm sorry, does that sound racist?
Absurd. It's hard not to react.
Does the language of the EU's foreign minister sound racist? Bizarre. But I'm just using his language.
Yes.
But no, in all seriousness, I mean, you had, and I think Eugene's made this point really well before, as historically speaking, the reaction to slave revolts has always been this like really vicious, violent response to make sure it doesn't happen again. And the reaction to Native Americans hitting back. And I think what we see here is, we're in sort of a crisis moment for capitalism, imperialism emanating from the global North, where what happened on October 7th scared not just the Israelis, it scared the Americans and it scared the Europeans, because we're moving towards a very different world where they might not always be the ones in charge. And I'm just curious if you could speak to that. I don't know what your thoughts are. Maybe you completely disagree. But, what do you think about the reaction that we're seeing, where you have this just full throttled, disgusting support for genociding Gaza in response to October 7th?
Well, I think we're living in a world where the reactions are becoming much more clear cut. I mean, on one hand, you clearly see how the ruling countries of the world, the countries that consider themselves to be the policemen of the world, the US, the European Union, Canada, Japan, look at what's happening in Palestine, say this is an attempt of the brutes, or as you say, the people who are coming from the margins, the people who are coming from the jungles, to try to take over what is theirs. But the narrative, the vision, the story that many people, I would say billions of people who inhabit the global south, and I would say not just people, but their leaders, their political leaders, are interpreting what's happening now as a confirmation of what we've been told to stay quiet about for the last 3 decades. We were told with the triumph of neoliberalism that colonialism was a thing of the past, that state violence on behalf of colonialism was a thing of the past, that we would no longer see massacres and violent actions like Israel and the US commit. But what we've seen, we've been forced to see, is actually an affirmation that colonialism is still alive, that the US imperial project is very much alive and intends, in this genocidal war in which it's sponsoring Israel's actions, it intends to wipe off the Palestinian people off the map. Who else has had to face this reality? You can look across the map of the global south and you will see hundreds of countries that have been faced with that same reality, with that same dilemma. So I think we've come to a point where it's no longer feasible for many countries in the global south, regardless of the ideological leanings of each of these governments, but it's become clear that they can no longer be silent. Because if we were to allow, under the current circumstances, for the people of Palestine to be wiped out in a shameful genocide, we know many other countries are next on the list. Because the project that the US is imposing with its bodyguard, with its Praetorian Guard called Israel in the region, it's not simply to wipe out the Palestinians, to impose its political and economic agenda on the rest of the region, and I would say the rest of the planet. Like we were talking in the past about Ukraine, and we did now with Palestine, it's clear that new lines are being created, new fault lines are being created in the world politics today. And at this point, if you don't have the courage to stand up for Palestine, it's almost like you are putting yourself at the back end of history, unable to see what's happening, and that there's a moving train of global outrage for Palestine that is moving quite fastly before our eyes. We either get on it or we will be crushed by it. And I think that will be the fate of Israel. It will be crushed by the global outrage that the world is experiencing.
Well, I'm glad that you pointed out the fact that it is really global and we're seeing a lot. And when we talk about the issue of quote unquote multipolarity, the question is, what are the different poles that are emerging? We've seen a pretty clear one, through the ALBA countries in the Americas presenting a very strong social vision. I mean, what have we seen from countries like Cuba, especially Venezuela and others, in terms of how they have responded to what's happening with this genocide in Gaza?
I mean, we have in general been seeing this tendency of many more countries officially speaking out. I mean, we have countries like Colombia and Bolivia that have, spoken out and have recalled their ambassadors, Belize, Chad, and many other countries around the world. But we have to recall I would say, courageous position even before October 7th. The fact that countries like Cuba broke relations with Israel in 1973, and since then have been the only country in Latin America who refuses, on all terms, in the most harshest of terms, to have any relations with Israel is remarkable. The fact that countries like Venezuela broke relations with Israel in 2006, at a time when it wasn't a popular thing to do. And both of these countries not only have, in a sense, been the clarion of consciousness for the rest of the region, and I would say for the rest of the world, they have sought to actually mobilize their people. I mean, last week, there was, I think, the only march in the world led by a head of state, the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, in support of the Cuban and Palestinian solidarity movement. And he spoke at this rally clearly saying, not only do we support the call for a ceasefire, but we support the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people to have a free and sovereign state. And I think this is just a demonstration of both the historic links between the peoples of Palestine and Latin America, and particularly Cuba. Also, that countries like Cuba, who in many ways are under heavy attack from the US, are not hesitating, are not afraid, are actually willing to take the courageous stand of being in solidarity with Palestine, whatever it may cost. It may cost many more years under the US blockade for Cuba, but that is not something that the Cubans, and they have articulated this very well, are willing to even consider when it comes to standing up or not for Palestine.
Do you think there's ever a chance that we go back? Like, it just kind of feels like we're in a new era after this, in terms of the way the vast majority of the world perceives the United States and its European partners moving forward. It just seems like this has really shattered whatever existed before October 7th. Especially, I mean, one thing when we talk about Cuba, for example, or any country in Latin America that dares to stand up to, the US trying to dictate how they can behave or run their countries, is this rhetoric of human rights and of democracy. I mean, we all know that a lot of those words are very meaningless when it comes from US officials. But you mentioned the last 30 years. For the last 30 years, this is the rhetoric that's been used. These are the tools that have been used to really try to beat countries in the global South into submission. Coups and destabilization campaigns in the name of human rights and democracy and abiding by liberalism and humanitarian values. It doesn't seem like any of that will be possible after what the US has supported in Gaza.
Well, at this point, I don't know what would be the normal that humanity would return to in relationship to the Palestinian struggle. I think that the global movement in solidarity with Palestine is only growing. It's becoming stronger. It's becoming an element of just basic elementary human consciousness at this point for billions of people around the planet. And that, in fact, it is generating sharp contradictions even within the US's own camp. I mean, everyone always refers to Latin America as the US's backyard, but I actually think the real backyard of the United States is Europe. In that backyard, in countries like Spain, for example, we're seeing major diplomatic standoffs between Israel and the Spanish government, for example, because the Spanish government, despite not being a left-wing or a progressive government, is actively calling for a ceasefire and has been rebuffed and attacked by the government of Israel for doing so. It's come to the point where, after weeks of attacks, now the Spanish government is even calling to recognize the state of Palestine. I think these are contradictions that will continue to sharpen over the next period. And then I imagine that in 2024, this movement is only going to grow because of the fact that Israel has not only demonstrated clearly, and this is being referred to by different states across the planet, it's being referred to for its war crimes. It's been clear to everyone its genocidal intent. But what has become even clearer to a larger number of people is that ultimately Zionism, the apartheid state, 75 years of occupation are not compatible with the most basic human values that we share as a global community. And in fact, the public and diplomatic space that Israel could have bought with all its US funds, with the billions of dollars it gets from the US, have been squandered because no one at this point believes, and as the majority of people in the world believe, that Israel has a right to exist as a racist and Zionist state predicated on violence against other people. No one believes that it has a right to defend itself when it is in fact an occupying power that uses brute violence and denigrates the humanity of the Palestinian people.
Manolo De Los Santos, co-executive director of the People's Forum, researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We are very thankful to you, as always, for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for your courageous journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate the words of Manolo, and I once again appreciate the fact that we have this platform, Breakthrough News, to speak to the people that we get to speak to. Because I mean, I'm still surprised how what we're like a 20,000 deaths, over 8,000 children, and man, when I every once in a while turn on CNN, I'm still stunned by how much cover up mainstream corporate media is willing to participate in. I think that something that Sarah said that really stuck with me, our guest from earlier, was this is the most televised genocide in history. And even as it's televised, and we see so many different aspects of it on our screens, on our social media feeds, on CNN itself, you still have the most powerful forces in the world justifying it and covering it up. And so I just want to go back to the fact that I appreciate that we are able to do the opposite of that, which is to bring the reality of what's a very disgusting and brutal massacre after massacre taking place in Gaza right now.
Indeed. No, absolutely. It's an honor, really, to be able to have the chance to do this and to bring some of these voices out. That will do it for us with many of these very important voices this week. But of course, we'll be back with you with even more next week. So we want to thank everyone, of course, who joined. Rania, before we close out here, anything you want to remind our listeners with before we leave?
Well, always, Eugene, I first and foremost want to remind our listeners to smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News on YouTube. Also, we have other social media platforms as well: Instagram, Twitter, TikTok for the younger people in the crowd. And also, if you do want to support Breakthrough News, you can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can get access to exclusive content in addition to very cool merch that has the Breakthrough logo on it, such as this awesome mug that I'm holding up. It comes in various colors. As you can see, Eugene's is in black and mine is in a very cool green. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it, you guys. Just make sure you support us in whatever capacity that you can so we can keep bringing you the reality that CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, the BBC, I could keep going on and on and on, spend all their resources trying to cover up.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thanks to everyone who watched, everyone who donated, everyone who's already a patron, of course, all of our guests, for myself, for Rania Khalek, and our whole team here at Breakthrough News. See you next time.